Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining me today in the Locher Room. I'm Alan Locher. I'm excited to speak with my next guest, Steven Capsuto, about his book, Alternate Channels, Queer Images on 20th Century Television. The book was first released in 2000 and explores the battle for lesbian and gay visibility on American television in the 20th century. The book documents countless famous or now forgotten programs, characters, and political skirmishes, examining gay portrayals and the era's few pioneering depictions of bisexual and trans people. Stephen recently re-released the revised 20th anniversary edition, which was fact-checked from scratch and reinstates material which the original publisher cut from the book, as well as 100 photos which were not also part of the original production. Please welcome to the Locher Room my guest, Steven Capsuto.
Hi, Alan.
Steven,
how are you doing?
How are you?
I'm doing fine. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I was excited to read that you're a Jersey boy like myself.
Yes, Camden County.
Very nice. I'm in Union County. Why don't we start, because I think we're not far apart in age, and you're coming out and what you were seeing, during that process, in terms of gay images for yourself.
I was very lucky. I came out in I knew I was gay by about 1975, but I wasn't really looking for media images until about 77. And by then things were getting pretty good, right? Not good by today's standards, but better than they had been. And so I was very lucky, right? There were all the talk shows like Donahue that would have lesbians and gay men on, and later Oprah, and there were characters on, Soap and other shows. But by the time I was volunteering with an LGBT crisis line in the late 80s, that apparently had changed. I was in grad school. I wasn't watching much TV, so I didn't know. But we were getting a lot of calls from lesbian and gay teenagers. It was a very different era. Almost nobody was out. We were invisible even to each other. There weren't a lot of role models. If a gay person's gayness was mentioned in the news, it was usually because they were, a killer or something. And the media thought, oh, well, they don't deserve privacy. So the images that were out there weren't great. And the images that were appearing on TV by the late 80s were pretty horrific. And we were getting a lot of calls from suicidal gay teens. And when we would ask them what they thought gay people's lives were like, what they thought they were, quote unquote, doomed to, we always got the same answer. They always said, I only know what I see on television. Which I found intriguing because, a decade earlier, I had seen fairly encouraging things on television where I could say, okay, yeah, there are gay people who have lives and families that talk to them and friends and careers. And that's not what they were seeing by 1989. So I was curious, and I started talking to older gay people I knew, people who were, I was in my 20s. I was talking to people in their 50s, 60s, 70s about the first images that they remembered. And I thought, okay, I might be able to get, a couple magazine articles out of this or something. I didn't think there would be a whole lot to write about. And 11 years later, it was a 500-page book. So that's how it came out.
It's incredible. Well, it's so interesting because I became a teenager in 79, 80. I turned 13 in 79. And, I definitely remember Soap. I definitely remember seeing things on All in the Family, which I'll get to. But, it really was till many, many years later. And even, I really wasn't out until, the end of the 80s, the early 90s, and still, running into a gay bar so I would not be seen. As you were talking about being seen, it was interesting. And, when I look at today, I'll watch a show like Glee or something, and I'm so thrilled that kids have something like that. And I think, wow, what we would have, not that what would we have been like, but, just to have, like a friend to look at, somebody who you might see. Did you always want to be a writer?
No, I really wanted to be a translator, which is what I mostly do for a living. I let other people structure the paragraphs and I just make them work in English, which is much easier. Writing is hard. But there was something I was going to say. Oh, you were talking about, what would it have been like when we were 15 to see images. I just watched the other night, Lifetime has a Christmas movie called The
I've heard
Christmas
about
Setup.
it.
Yeah, with Fran Drescher, and it's a sort of your typical, almost like Hallmark style Christmas romance movie, right? The person who moved off to New York and has the high-powered career, but comes back to the town where they grew up and runs into their high school crush, and they reconnect, and da da. So, and it's that sort of cliched romantic Christmas story, but with a gay male couple played by two actors who are actually a couple who've been together for 10 years. So the chemistry is pretty convincing.
That I didn't realize. That's great.
And I was thinking, gosh, how much good would it have done me at age 15 to see that? You know, because there was nothing like that when we were kids or teenagers.
I mean, there's still not a lot, you know.
No, but there's a few. I just know there were a few Christmas movies this year. There's the Christmas Setup. There's whatever the one is that's set on a ranch in Colorado. I can't remember what that's called. Oh, Dashing in December. That's another gay male romance. There's Black Entertainment Television had one called The Christmas Lottery, where there's a lesbian couple who's adopting a child. So it's out there in ways. And I'm pointing out Christmas movies because that used to be, you know, sort of the litmus tests for how comfortable the media executives are with a topic is, will they put it in shows about teenagers, and will they put it in Christmas stories? And we've sort of hit that point
because
with
Christmas
LGBT characters.
Christmas being religious.
And wholesome, and we're somehow unwholesome, I guess. We're not there on trans characters. I still have not seen, you know, trans characters. You're starting to see trans teen characters on series a little bit. But I certainly have not seen any kind of a central trans character recently in a Christmas, you know, TV movie or special or something like that.
Was there something that prompted you that you were seeing in the media now to update the book? Or you just were...
I think, you know, I started, a few times I've started doing a follow-up volume about the 21st century. And it's very tricky. For one thing, it doesn't matter as much, right? I mean, really, the media, television images were most important I don't know, 96, 97, when people started having internet connections at home, and suddenly there were other windows onto the world. Whereas before that, television really was the window onto the world, how you found out about people who lived differently than you do, or things that you didn't know about. And now there are other possibilities out there. I remember when I got my first computer modem in 1992, I think it was. So this is 2 years before the World Wide Web existed. But there were still, you know, online, you would dial into a BBS somewhere with your little phone modem, you know, and there was this gay forum I was on, and there was a 15-year-old lesbian in rural Georgia who was a regular participant in the group. And I thought, this is a world changer, that every day she can get together and chat with, you know, there were 10 regulars. I mean, there weren't a lot of people online, right? And we were spread across the world, but she could talk to 10 people who were young, mostly young gay people like herself. And so she had some source of information other than what was on TV, which wasn't great at the time, and other than the hellfire and brimstone sermons she was hearing at church.
Interesting. And I was going to ask, and there might not be anything to this, but there was something I read about that there were things not published in the book when you first released it, that the publisher left out. And it may not be salacious. Was there a particular reason that they left it out? You know,
well, I mean, the edits, the editor was very good, and mostly he was just tightening things up. You know, when you do something that is research based, you kind of want to show off that you did your homework, and so you put in far more than you really ought to, and it becomes bulky and unwieldy. And so almost everything he cut was worth cutting, but I did put some of it back in for this edition. Some of it were I wish I could remember specifics. Some of it were things that weren't particularly interesting in 2000, but that a little later became interesting, you know, because of things that developed later, or somebody who wasn't famous then and is famous now, that sort of thing. And then as you mentioned, I re-fact checked the whole book from scratch, sentence by sentence, because when I started doing the research in '89, and the book came out in 2000, so most of that, there was no internet, or there wasn't much on the internet.
Right.
And so I was a lot of what I was doing was secondary source research. There were shows that were thought to be lost, that no recordings survived. So I was quoting dialogue from newspaper reviews of the shows. And of course, that was a reviewer who was sitting there with a notepad scribbling and getting things wrong. And in some cases now, the recordings have been found and are online. The indices to CBS, ABC, and NBC newscasts are online. There's lots of things that I'm able to nail down now that I couldn't find then.
Interesting.
The one thing I completely rewrote, the section on Christine Jorgensen, who was really the first famous trans person in the U.S., who was outed by a family friend in 1952 and was headlines all over the country. And I had the timeline of her early TV appearances wrong because, again, I was working from what I could find in newspapers and, little clips that turned up in documentaries that I had to guess, is that television? Is that newsreel? Her hair sort of looks 1957, or there, that dress looks sort of early 50s. And I got the timeline wrong. Whereas now I was able to nail it perfectly and rewrite that section. And I did a few.
Yeah, I mean, you researched this really like by hand, because there was no, like you said, no web. So it's really even more intricate what you were able, all of the research, all the things that you, without the internet to watch and listen to.
I radio, had 3 VCRs I had 3 VCRs connected to different cable boxes in different part of my home. And every week when TV Guide would come out, I would sit down and read every entry and circle anything that sounded like it might have a gay angle. And then there were certain shows I knew had done gay episodes. Like I knew there was this cop show in the 60s called NYPD, really good show shot in New York. And I knew they had done at least one gay episode. I knew the title. And I knew that the Nostalgia Channel was rerunning that show 5 nights a week. So I just taped that every night until they got to the episode I was looking for. And I did that with a bunch of shows. So yeah, I had VCRs all over the place, just recording channels. And then I would take notes and put that in my database and sort it chronologically. And yeah.
And did I read something like 2,000 things you've watched or hours? I forget what there was a 2,000.
I think when the original book came out, I think I had notes taken from 1,200 recordings, and I had information in my database from various sources about 4,000 shows, starting with early radio broadcasts going up to early 2000, and then the book came out that summer.
And what I find interesting, were people willing to talk a lot about this subject?
I was so surprised. Network executives and early gay activists and script writers and producers. One of the first people I interviewed was, I don't know if you know, on channel, you're in the New York viewing area, right? On channel 13, they run a talk show called The Open Mind, which has been around since the 50s. And in the 50s, they did 3 broadcasts, 3 panel discussions of homosexuality. And the show's original host, who's the grandfather of the current host, his name was Richard Hefner, who had been one of my history professors at Rutgers. He gave me an interview about these 3 shows he had done about homosexuality in the mid-50s. And he said, I have been waiting for more than 30 years for someone to ask me about those shows. And he had all these great stories about, the first of the 3 aired, and supposedly what he was told by the network, bosses was that Cardinal Spellman had called and threatened to challenge Channel 4's relicensure if they aired the 2nd and 3rd shows on the topic. It was, that taboo in 1956, 57.
Well, yeah, I mean, I started actually my career as a page, and which was mid 80s. And when one of your jobs was to answer viewer phone calls. Granted, I didn't have to take them during anything that had gay representation, but I remember getting phone calls on, nonsense. So I can only imagine what would have transpired, for the networks when it was All in the Family, or, airing those types of things at that top, the 70s, which was 15 years before, I was at ABC. I mean, the those organizations were something, which I will ask you about as well. Is there a particular message you wanted people to take away, from the book?
Yeah, it sort of has changed over time. So when I was writing the first edition, because the representation of gay characters had declined so much between 1977 and 89, it was really meant to be sort of an expose of the slanderous images of gay people on television, and also a case study of the activism that had been done in the 70s to bring about the images that I had seen. Because what had happened was, originally you couldn't discuss anything LGBT openly on television. It was actually a violation of the broadcast code. It wasn't a matter of law, but it was the code the industry had created to prevent the government from instituting censorship. So it was a self-censorship decency code that had started on radio. It expanded into television in the 50s and was still in place. So originally you could hint, but you couldn't say that a character was queer. And then as the topic became more open in society, you had a couple of years of very cautious, well-meaning shows that, didn't get it quite right, but were trying. And then by 73 to 75, it was terrible. Like, every queer character you saw was a child molester, a killer, a terrorist, at one after another. I mean, even on PBS, upstairs, downstairs, the family's former footman axe murdered his male lover. It was just everywhere, or it was the disease of the week on Marcus Welby, MD. It was just not good. And really where it climaxed was, there was this episode of Policewoman. Remember Angie Dickinson, right?
Yeah,
Policewoman.
yeah.
And where she goes undercover in a nursing home run by this gang of killer lesbians. And the episode was called Flowers of Evil. And gay organizations got wind of the script in advance, because of course there were people at the production company who were gay. And when they would see these scripts, they would surreptitiously photocopy them and then send them to gay organizations and say, yeah, you might want to raise this issue with the production company and the network. Right? So that was really one of the turning points. That and just before that, an episode of Marcus Welby, MD, 2 episodes of Marcus, that got the gay liberation movement into media activism. And so in a lot of ways, I saw the book as
which one got gay? Which one? Marcus Welby, you said?
So there were 2 Marcus Welby episodes, one where homosexuality was the disease of the week, and one that was about a male teacher who was raping 15-year-old boys. And then that was followed right on its heels was this Policewoman episode about the gang of killer lesbians. And there had been a lot of other shows like these. And so previously, I think the gay liberation movement, which had started out as pretty, far left. There was the homophile movement, which was more conservative in some ways by that point. But the gay liberation movement was pretty far left, and I think they saw entertainment media as a lost cause. That's part of, a corrupt society. We're not going to worry about that. We're going to focus on, police harassment and decriminalization and so on. And I think at some point around 74, they started to realize that in a culture where entertainment media is that central, again, this is pre-internet, that you did have to worry about those images. If you're fighting for your rights, if you're fighting for decriminalization and anti-discrimination law, including anti-discrimination against gay school teachers, and if all the images out there are of us, raping children and killing people, that's a problem. So around 73, 74, 75, the movement starts in a very focused and organized way lobbying the entertainment media, doing the sort of work that years later GLAAD would be doing, right?
Yeah.
And once GLAAD came around, the groups that had been doing that before in the 70s went back to focusing just on civil rights. Groups like, what is now the National LGBTQ Task Force and Human Rights Campaign. Well, HRC wasn't some, but the task force was one of the central media activist groups in the 70s. So I saw this originally as a case study of how one of the most marginalized groups in society had been able to, through very focused and well-organized lobbying, change their media image in the course of one generation. So that's what the first edition was about, because that clearly needed to be done again in 1989. But by the time the book came out in 2000, they had sort of succeeded, right? There was much more inclusive imagery, not so much around bi and trans characters, but at least around gay and lesbian characters. And so it was like, now it's a case study of a success story, and other minority groups could emulate this. The new edition that came out in January is more of a history. And because a lot of it's sort of evenly focused on three things: the images that were on the air, so it works as sort of a nostalgia book, right? You open and you see the photo of Beverly LaSalle on All in the Family, or the lesbian character on Heartbeat, and so on. And I remember that character, yes. So it's partly a history of what was on the air in the 20th century, and how that reflected our changing status in society over time. But it's also kind of a history of the movement, looking at it through the window of one facet of the movement, which was media activism. But it also is looking at the opposing movement, the anti-gay media activist groups like the American Family Association and Focus on the Family and all of those groups, and the rise of televangelism and all of that, where they discovered that the two topics that brought in the most money is if they sermonized against homosexuality and abortion. And as soon as they figured out that those were the money makers, those became the obsession of that sort of right-wing evangelical media.
Crazy. And it's crazy to think, like you said, like there were so many images in the 70s and then it disappeared in the 80s. But like All in the, just talk about like one show, like All in the Family and that and their impact.
All in the Family was amazing because, prior to that, if you think about what American sitcoms were before All in the Family went on in 71. So what was a hit before then? The Beverly Hillbillies. The Brady Bunch was like the most alternative family on the air. And a widower and a widow who married and merged their families, right? It was a very conservative.
And in reality, there would be a gay child when there were that many of them.
Of course. It's Norman Lear, who was one of the producers of that show, said, before All in the Family, sitcoms were about happy white people with happy white problems. And his goal was to sort of break that. And, he said, and people would say to him, how dare you put, political issues and social justice issues into an entertainment show? And he said, the thing is that the exclusion of those issues before that was also political. That landscape devoid of acknowledging that racism existed, that homophobia existed, that alcoholism existed, that any kind of problems existed other than who's going to take the daughter to the prom, that was political. And he felt that there was nothing that he could do in his sitcoms that could even begin to counterbalance the politics of all that exclusion. He's an amazing guy, and he's still working. He's like 97.
Oh my God. I love what he did with One Day at a Time in the new, and a lesbian Latino, Latina. Just looking at what some of our viewers who are watching you and I right now, somebody said, I learned about gay from Three's Company and I learned about lesbians from the Golden Girls. But it was, so the 70s, you talked about how there were so many characters, and then AIDS came along in the 80s, and that just shifted the paradigm completely because of fear, right? Is that? And
it varied by year. So, like, for example, one of the top shows in the 80s was the primetime soap opera Dynasty, which there's a reboot of now, right? But it was a very big hit in the 80s. And the idea was, okay. And so, there were seasons where Steven was involved with women. There were seasons where he was involved with men briefly, and then the men were usually killed violently in one way or another. But when, the way soap operas get written, at least the primetime ones, is they write what they call a Bible for the season, right? Which is the head writer and the producer sit down and say, all right, here's this, 20-page type written thing of what's going to happen to all the characters in the next season. And I was lucky to be able to look at copies of the Bibles from every season of Dynasty, or almost every season. And every season, the intention was that Steven would be involved with a guy. And in the years when the public was most panicked about AIDS, the network said, you can't do that. And so they would have to rewrite it and say, okay, he's questioning his sexuality. He marries this woman. They have a kid. Then he's with a guy. The guy gets killed the next season. And then he's with a woman again because, people found out Rock Hudson had AIDS. And I don't know if you remember, there was a real major violent backlash against it. I remember I was a student at the time, and the gay student group was getting death threats on our phone. And it was, so AIDS definitely affected things, but it also, what it did, because the networks tend to use queer content to prove, or they used to, how edgy they were, the way they sort of use trans content sometimes now, right? This is this taboo. We're such a daring show. We're more interesting than all the old reruns of older shows that couldn't do this, right? So they still wanted to do that with gay characters, but they didn't feel comfortable doing it with gay men. And so that's where you first start to get this emergence of lesbian characters who are somewhat well-rounded characters, who aren't being associated with death and murder, which is what lesbian characters historically had been associated with on American TV. Lesbian characters on TV, even into the mid-'80s, usually either she was a killer, she had been killed, sometimes by another lesbian, or if you wanted a really sympathetic character, like on All in the Family in '77, or on The Golden Girls in the mid-'80s, it was a lesbian whose lover had died, and therefore she would get sympathy. But there was always some sort of a connection with death. And starting around the mid-'80s, that opens out a bit, a little bit. It gets much better in the '90s.
Well, you talked about an interesting thing in the book, because I used to work on the soap opera Guiding Light.
Oh, I love that, yeah.
And you talk about, I had no idea that the myths about lesbians back in I think it was the 50s, or actually earlier, because it was on radio.
The joke episode that the staff recorded. Yeah, I think what happened was when it went to television, they moved from one coast to the other and basically fired most or all of the radio staff. And as a parting gift to the show's creator, Erna Phillips, the cast recorded a joke episode with every taboo that you couldn't do on the air in the 50s. And one of them was that this very sort of, man trap of a character was bisexual and had affairs with women, that, it wasn't for broadcast. But what it tells you is, so many people say, well, the reason they didn't have gay characters in the 50s is that people didn't know homosexuality existed. No, they knew. See, here's some evidence right here. They knew. And Guiding Light, I mean, did some really wonderful things in terms of
well, we did
later.
Right before the show went off the air. I was at Guiding Light and As the World Turns, and both shows before they went off the air. We had Luke and Noah on As the World Turns.
Nuke,
and then and then we had Otalia on Guiding Light. But those shows were owned by Procter and Gamble, which they are a PG company, that they have that things to be careful about, when they're
right. They did. I mean, they did do a gay character in the late '80s, but
on As the World Turns, who had AIDS. Hank Elliott, correct?
Yeah. But it was very cautious. I mean, the CBS soaps were always a little more cautious than the ABC one. ABC was out there with gay characters, starting in '83. And
I think it would have been different if Disney owned ABC back at that time. It's a different thing. P&G owned As the World Turns and Guiding Light and Search for Tomorrow and Another World. There's a corporate level of responsibility that they are looking out for, and I understand that.
Yeah.
But it, there is a way to still continue to tell a story without jeopardizing. Like you said, the Hank story wasn't fleshed out enough.
Yeah, whereas the difference was, I think, also that when ABC bought out Agnes Nixon's soaps in the '70s, they had already been established as being very issue-oriented and pushing the envelope, and ABC knew what they were getting. So it wasn't owned by the sponsor; it was owned by the network. So it was a different playing field. And I don't really know much about the NBC soaps, like who was in control there, because they were really much later out of the gate with queer characters.
Yeah, and you talk about the Donna Pascow character on All My Children.
Yeah.
In the book.
You know, there's in the 80s, Agnes Nixon did a series of seminars at what is now the Paley Center for Media. Back then with the Museum of Broadcasting. And someone asked her about gay characters in soaps. And this was about 2 years before the Donna Pascow character. And she said, you know, I've been thinking about how do you put gay characters into a soap opera? Because a TV movie is easy, right? It's an hour and a half, and you can just focus on the characters, and you don't have to back out and have homophobic characters. But on a soap opera where you're doing, you know, 5 episodes a week, and it's about a community, it would have to turn ugly in some way at some point, and she wasn't sure she wanted that to be the story. And the way they dealt with it in 83 with the Donna Pascow character, Donna Pascow was, I think she wanted to be on the show because her boyfriend or husband was on the show. And she had been working on the other coast and wanted to be in the same city with him. And so, but she had a commitment starting in January. So she said, I can tape 8 weeks, that's it. And so they had her character be a lesbian, but who was only out of the closet to one close friend. And that's how they avoided the homophobia stories, is that basically nobody knew that she was gay except for this one character.
Interesting.
You know, and then a little later, you know, when you get into the mid-90s and there's the gay school teacher character Michael and the closeted gay teen, and then later Bianca, all my children, and also One Life to Live, the sister show, you know, down the road.
I mean, they really tackled it. They tackled the AIDS quilt, which was phenomenal with Ryan Felipe. Yeah, and
that they made the gay teen character. Of course, it was the summer because that's when you do teen stories on a show. They made him a central figure. He intersected every storyline on that show for months. And that was just really amazing that they did that in 1992 when no one else was doing anything like that.
Right. We, you know, it was really surprising. We did it on World Turns with Luke, who was who grew up on the show, but it was already in the 2000s. You know, it wasn't as early.
And it was a little cautious. I liked it. I enjoyed it. I recorded lots of it, but it felt more cautious than what I was seeing on ABC, you know.
You're definitely right on that, definitely. But again, it's, you know, the network comparison to being owned by
network versus sponsor, right?
Sponsor, yeah, exactly. So let's talk about, you know, the 90s. I mean, Ellen and Will and Grace. But, you know, I'm curious your take, you know, because I remember, I think Ellen and Will and Grace really had big impacts on me because I was, you know, 20s and 30s. I remember going to, you know, Splash in New York City to watch Ellen's Coming Out episode. You know, everyone was gathering at that time to watch it. And it was such a positive thing for our community at that time. But then she loses everything afterwards. So I'm curious, you know, if there's what you saw from both angles of that.
I think the biggest mistake they made with Ellen was right after the coming out, they like fired the writers and hired a new team. And what was happening behind the scenes, all of their sort of headbutting with the network censors, who were really being kind of ridiculous in their demands and putting, you know, content warnings on episodes that were so much tamer than some of the straight stuff that was going out without content warnings. The writers were kind of bitter and angry, and that started showing through in the script, and they just weren't as consistently funny as they had been. You know, there were episodes that were clearly, you know, this is us, we're going to criticize TV censorship, or it wasn't necessary. And when they backed away from that, some of the best episodes in that last season were ones that weren't doing that. And I think if they had just, you know, kept that stuff out of the script, that anger out of the script, because it's not an angry show. It wasn't, you know, it wasn't All in the Family. Like if it had been this social criticism show for years, and then they added the gay angle, it would have been fine. The episodes about her and her girlfriend were lovely. It was romantic comedy, sitcom. It was sort of like a lesbian Mad About You. It was lovely, right? Or the episode with Emma Thompson playing herself. I don't know if you saw that one where, you know, she has her deep dark, supposedly Ellen finds out that Emma Thompson is secretly a lesbian and is trying to get her to come out. And it's a fun episode. And if they had just kept doing that sort of thing rather than, you know, the episode where the network kept saying, well, can't you make her more like Lucy? So they did an episode that was like a send-up of 60s sitcoms, which really was only there to make a point to the ABC censors that why do we at home need to see that, right?
Right.
You know, or the episode about the behind the scenes, you know, just so a lot of people were of the opinion that, oh, it was just the show was too gay. No, it wasn't the show was too gay. It was just that the writing took a nosedive. Not consistently. Like I said, there were good episodes, but it was problematic often enough that people stopped watching, I think. You know, and at its best, it's a great show.
It was hysterical.
Yeah,
but did
Will
it
and
have
Grace
a negative effect on things coming after it because it was canceled and she sort of lost, you know?
I mean, she was back shortly thereafter with another sitcom. So, I mean, it wasn't like her career was over. Oh, we're back. Okay.
Yeah.
And there were other sitcoms right after it. There was right after it was, well, Will and Grace was right after it. Normal, Ohio with John Goodman was right after it. So it wasn't like the network said, "Up, that's it. We're not doing gay characters at the center of a sitcom anymore." You know,
I don't remember the one you just said. But you talk about in that prior to the 90s, though, there weren't really recurring characters until shows like Ellen and Will and Grace.
There were central characters.
Central characters.
There were recurring. There was the wacky neighbor who maybe was gay, or there were characters who would show up a few times a season. So in the 70s, you had the gay couple on Barney Miller who would sort of float through every so often, which they had to fight the network over. The network didn't want those characters there, and they said, it's a police station in Greenwich Village. How do you have no gay people? We need to have gay people. So there was that. There was Beverly, who turned up 3 or 4 times on All in the Family. There were things like that, but not central characters who you saw week after week. There was Jody on Soap starting. That's not true. There were characters earlier. There was a show in '72 called The Corner Bar with this sort of very wrist-flicking theatrical designer character played by Vincent Schiavelli, who was great fun, who would introduce himself and say, "Hello, I'm a close personal friend of Angela Lansbury's." And then there was the Nancy Walker show, but that didn't last very long. And then there was the Nancy Walker show where her secretary, her live-in secretary, was this sort of campy, fun gay man. But the first hit show with a gay character was Soap, and they really just couldn't. I mean, Billy Crystal was very charming in the role, and it just took them so long to figure out how to write that character. You know, in the pilot, he's trans, and then he's a gay man who's not trans but is dating a football player and is thinking of having the surgery so they'll appear to be a straight couple. I mean, it was just a mess. And finally, they figured out how to write the character, but after the first few episodes, he never had a boyfriend. You know, he occasionally would question his sexuality and date women, sort of very Dynasty, you know. And I remember an article in the Advocate at the what?
What year is Soap?
Soap is 77 to 81.
So that's probably my first real, you know, I was 11, 12, and I remember Soap a lot, you know, big time in my head.
Oh, so we are about the same age.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I was 13 when it went on.
Yeah.
And I loved that show. That's the interesting thing. I don't remember gay characters on the Nancy Walker show or the Corner Bar, but boy, did I love those shows. And
I don't remember Barney Miller. I watched that from time to time. I don't remember in my head like gay characters, but it would make sense for a police station in Greenwich Village.
Yeah.
For sure.
And we did some episodes where, like, it was this couple. The first time you meet them, like, one of them is a purse snatcher, and he's the sort of more like 70s camp idea of straight person's camp idea of what a gay person is, right? And his partner had been married and had, I think, an 8-year-old son. And there's an episode about the wife violating the custody agreement and not letting him see the son. So there were some serious things, but mostly they were just these likable local characters who were friendly with the cops, who were initially wary of the cops because the cops were the people who used to raid the bars. This is 75, sure. 6 years after Stonewall, 5 years after the what was it, the Snake Pit raid or whatever it was called. Gay people were wary of the cops, and so they played with that tension on the show a little.
Wow. So I know in the book you talk a lot about, and we spoke earlier about the, GLAAD and those types of organizations. Is there one or two like large network fights that took place on a particular show that stands out in your mind?
Well, the one that stands out the most, I think, just because it's the chapter that sold the book to Random House in the first place, is about that police woman episode. Because the main gay groups that were around at the time, the Gay Activists Alliance and a few other groups, were targeting the sponsors and trying to negotiate. And there was this splinter group that had broken off from GAA that was called Lesbian Feminist Liberation, LFL. And they decided that a more direct ZAP protest was needed. And so a number of women from their group went in at different, it was like something out of a spy movie. They coordinated, all right, you go in at 1:30, you go in at 1:38, and you go to this floor, and then you tape the door open on the stairwell, and then so-and-so goes up. And they took over the offices and staged a sit-in in the offices of the head of standards and practices at NBC. And meanwhile, they had also coordinated with local feminist groups and had a giant rally in front of NBC headquarters. At one point, I forget, Ginny Vida or somebody walked out on the balcony and unfurled this giant multi-story banner that said, NBC oppresses lesbians. And, Bella Abzug spoke at the, it was a thing, and the other New York stations covered it because, I don't think Channel 4 covered it. But right, everyone else covered it.
Yeah, they would never cover it, but that's great. Who knew? Policewoman. I mean, I had no idea.
Yeah.
That would be the thing. What do you think are some of the biggest gains we've made about representation since the book has come out?
I think the biggest thing is casual inclusion. I remember years ago, like in '89, I think, I heard Vito Russo give his celluloid closet lecture. And he talked about how where gay people were in the movies in the 80s was sort of where black people had been in the 60s, right? Like you would have films like, well, a couple of years later, like Philadelphia, which was like the gay equivalent of a 60s Sidney Poitier movie, right? He's the nice gay guy who we straight people in the audience, and like at no point does it occur to you that members of that minority group are part of the intended audience for this film, right? You're being talked about in the third person, and the character is only ever allowed to talk about what it is like to be a member of that minority group, right? It's never just like a person who happens to be gay living their lives. It has to be, I have something to tell you, or there's an issue and it's civil rights, and I'm a school teacher and I should be able to keep my job. And what happens is, and then also in the when you first started to get the teenage characters, what gave permission for that, because it used to be in the 70s and early 80s, you could do a story about homophobia in a high school, but it always had to turn out at the end that the targeted student was really straight. That like what's bad about homophobia is that it might accidentally victimize a straight person. So gay kids were this abstraction off camera. And what gives permission for them to suddenly be on camera in the late 80s and more going toward the mid 90s was the big federal youth suicide study, which found that gay teens were 3 times as likely to end their own lives than anyone else. And suddenly that became allowable. And so now they were where the adult gay characters had been a couple of years earlier, and they could only talk about the oppression of gay people. And at some point, the the character had to be driven to the verge of suicide. The Billy Douglas character was an example. Or a couple of years later on My So-Called Life, the Wilson Cruz character, Ricky. You couldn't just have a gay teen who was having a life. Horrible things had to happen to them. Otherwise, you couldn't do the story. And now we're at the point where you can just have characters who happen to be gay, straight, whatever, and it's not an issue. It's not the only thing they can talk about. They're well-rounded characters. The first time I saw that, and it was a show that really did it right across the whole queer spectrum almost, was Tales of the City back in the 90s. You know, it's just, you know, and it was exactly the way he had written the book, right? Is here are some characters, and some of them are straight, and some of them are gay, and some are bi, and some are trans, and they have love lives, and they have friends, and they have jobs, and you know, that's not all they're allowed to talk about.
Yeah, Tales of the City was great.
Yeah, and that was at one point or another in development at almost every network, including HBO in the 70s or early 80s. And Armistead Maupin, who wrote the novels, would go into and it was at most movie studios at one point or another. He would go into the session with the producers and say, I have one question before we discuss anything else. Will Michael and John be allowed to kiss on screen? And the answer was always no, and the deal was off, right? Because either they wanted to only focus on the straight storylines, or they wanted Michael to be the wacky gay neighbor down the hall who is there to listen to the straight people's problems, but not have his own life. You know, that's not. And Channel 4 in the UK came to him and he asked that question, and he said, they told him, no, you don't understand. We got money to adapt your novel. If we are not faithful to your novel, we will lose our funding. And so Channel 4 UK shot it in the US with a mostly American cast and aired it, and PBS bought for a pittance the rights to run it in the US. And there was that big Republican freak out in Congress over, you know, where they were like mailing VHS tapes to every member of Congress with the most salacious moments of Tales of the City and saying, see, this is why you should defund public broadcasting. Yeah.
But he stuck his ground, Armistead Maupin. He wasn't going to do it. Yeah, which is really great. One of our viewers wrote, Cagney and Lacey and Kate and Allie and My Two Dads. Were they, is that something that was true, that they had to always make sure they had love interest to not, you know, think those characters were gay? Do you know?
Yeah, and in fact, one of the very first episodes of Kate and Allie, not one of the very first, but a very early episode, is the one where their landlady wants to raise their rent because they are two families living in a one-family dwelling, and they go apartment hunting, and every place they look at is worse than the last, and finally they decide they're going to tell the landlady they're a lesbian couple. And
I remember that.
And the landlady says, is what you told me true? And they're like, yes. And she said, why didn't you tell us? Well, we were ashamed, so ashamed. And she said, oh, you poor thing. And then she brings in her lover. And it turns out the landlady's a lesbian. And then you never see her again, but we have established that Kate and Allie are straight. You know, Cagney and Lacey, I don't know if you've ever seen the first season before Sharon Gless was there, when it was Meg Foster.
I don't know.
So the reason, I always thought it was weird, why is Tyne Daly, who's sort of the more butch of the two, named Lacey? Well, it's because Cagney was originally really, really butch in the first season. And they set you up in the first 3 episodes, I think it is, to think she's a lesbian. And then they because the whole show was originally about sort of breaking sexist stereotypes. And it was this very feminist show originally. And if you can find, I think it's now.
I'm going to look. I don't remember somebody playing opposite.
Well, in the pilot, it's Loretta Swit, but she was busy with MASH, so she couldn't do the series. And then, Meg Foster, and she's really good, but she's super butch. And what they do, if I'm remembering right, in the first couple of episodes, you'll like see the room, and there's a really attractive woman, and there are some men around. And then you cut to her sort of looking lasciviously in that direction. And they totally set you up to think she's a lesbian, and then it turns out she's not. And it's like, haha, you can't trust stereotypes, you know.
Yeah, and Tyne was married on that show. That I remember, right? I can't remember who were.
That was a great show. That was groundbreaking, because it was one of the first shows where you had, people talk about the Bechdel test. That was a show that passed the Bechdel test, right? It was two women characters who were supportive of each other. We knew their backstory. They talk about something other than men, right? Because like there had been shows with women in central roles, but they were usually rivals. It was the women on Dynasty shoving each other into fountains and tearing each other's wigs off and things. It wasn't, you didn't have quite, and Kate and Allie was unusual for that reason too, is that it was two women who were just friends and being supportive of each other. And there wasn't a lot of that on TV before. There was some.
Interesting. Where do you think some of the best representation is today?
Oh, the streaming platforms are doing amazing things.
Yeah. Somebody
because
just
they don't have to worry about sponsors mostly.
Happiest Christmas just aired. Somebody was just saying that they watched the
Happiest Christmas. Which one is
it? Was it Happiest Christmas? Is that the one? The
Happiest Season. Oh, I hated
Happiest
that.
Season. Yeah, I didn't love it, but somebody,
Yeah, I'm glad it exists, but oh my God, Abby, ditch her and go out with her ex. You can do so much better.
Yeah, for me it was Dan Levy and Schitt's Creek. I mean, talk about some,
Yeah.
If that, I mean, and to think, the whole thing about that show, the build on that show, that everybody and their mother has now seen that show basically, is a really great thing for, little kids, coming down the road, to be gay, because it really just,
it's just there. And in teen shows, that's like the biggest thing I think is for gay teens to see gay teens and trans teens and bi teens who are not getting beaten up, who are not, drinking themselves into oblivion. And it's what it also does is it models behavior for the non-queer teens to see, oh yeah, that's a straight character and his best friend is a lesbian, or this is a bi woman character and her best friend is straight, or that those models are out there, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, it really, like I said at the beginning, Glee for me, and maybe part of it was, my dad never knew I was gay, and that relationship of the father and son was something we really never, Kurt and his dad, you never saw that before. It was really something to see. The show wasn't perfect and, in no way, but I stuck with it because I felt like this is on television. I'm just so happy it is for, the younger generation. It was something like that. So you started going out and speaking about this in the 1990s, right? Mm-hmm. Giving lectures.
Yeah, starting in 90. I had actually done, when I was a student in the late 80s, I had organized video nights. Because again, there wasn't streaming, and there was, and most shows weren't out on home video. Most people didn't even have VCRs yet when I was in grad school. And so I would organize, I had started recording these things. I got my first VCR in 87. And so I would do a night and run, a Barney Miller episode and an All in the Family and a Golden Girls. And then I got in the habit of just recording everything I watched and erased most of it. But that way, if there was something surprisingly interesting, I had it. And Nick at Night was rerunning, for syndication, it was retitled Susie with Ann Sothern. Where it was originally called Private Secretary. And there's an episode, this is from the 50s. Do you know who Franklin Pangborn was? You would recognize him. He was like the sissy in every 1930s and 40s movie. Usually with, a bowler hat and a walking stick and white gloves clutched in a hand and a carnation and a striped suit. And he made his whole career, he was this gay man who made his whole career playing these sort of sissy characters, prissy characters. And I used that clip to explain how you could, in the 50s, I would say, they would hint that a character was gay, but they couldn't tell you. And people would say, well, what would that look like? And so I finally had this episode to show where he's playing this male secretary. So right away, it's the 50s, that's a man and a woman's job. Something's not right here, right? And at one point he says that, I had always dreamed of being an interior designer, but when you have to hang drapes, you've got to climb ladders, and I bruise so easily. So, you know, it's just, you just stack one stereotype on top of another until the audience can't miss what you're doing, but you can't say that he's gay. You know, so I would do these video nights and I would show things like that. And again, I was sort of like walking in Vito Russo's footsteps. What he had done with the celluloid closet about cinema, I was doing with television. And he, in the 70s, used to do these video nights at Gay Activist Alliance meetings. I was doing them at gay groups in Philly. But the lecture started in 90 at this big Northeast regional conference of LGB organizations at the time. And I had not rehearsed it well enough, and so it was supposed to be, I think, an hour and 50 minutes, and it ran 3 hours, and nobody left, because people at that time were so hungry for images of people like themselves. And again, you couldn't stream, you couldn't buy video. It was a chance to see these things they hadn't seen. And I thought, okay, this is interesting. And I started doing the college lecture circuit, and I got to be in places. You know, I did a talk in Rush Limbaugh's hometown out in southeastern Missouri, which was an experience. 8 people showed up. They said it was the largest attendance they had had up to that point at a gay student event. And the local newspaper had all these angry letters to the editor about the fact that the school was having this gay awareness week, and you know, very sort of anti-sodomite letter. No, they weren't even letters to the editor. I'm sorry. This was actually kind of cool and inclusive. The local paper, because they knew the literacy rates in the surrounding farm communities weren't 100%, they had their sound off page. So you could call their answering machine and leave your angry homophobic views, and then they would type them up and put them in the paper. So, and like, I was meeting people who seemed freaked. People would ask me, oh, what are you doing on campus? And I would say, oh, I'm giving this talk about, you know, gay images in the media. And they would be like this. And then if I mentioned I was Jewish, I think they couldn't decide which bothered them more, that I was gay or that I was Jewish. It was very strange. I am sure.
We have both things in common. You and I.
I am sure Cape Girardeau, Missouri is much better now, but this was 1991, and it was an experience. Yeah.
That's so funny. Yeah, we didn't. Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I would have been there in a heartbeat if I had seen you on campus, because you're right. You know, would have been looking for anything. You know, it wasn't really till I graduated college that I really came, and I wasn't fully out, but it's interesting. Are you working on another book? For the 21st century? Have you decided?
It's very hard to strike. I've been trying to, but it's very hard to strike her, partly because it doesn't matter as much because there's other sources of information, and partly because it's less structured. Right? If you're writing about the 20th century, for most of the 20th century, there are 3 or 4 networks, and then toward the end of the century, maybe 2 cable channels producing original comedy, drama, and variety. So that's easy. It's linear, and everybody's watching the shows at more or less the same time. And so now there are shows where I'll see an ad. It'll say, you know, season 12 of this series is about to start, and I'm like, I've never even heard of that series. How is it season 12? You know. Just because there are just so many platforms, which is great, because what that allows is specialization. It used to be with the old broadcast network model, you needed to get X number of million people watching the show at the same time in order for the network to keep you on the air, because the product that the network is selling, as you know, isn't the shows, it's the viewers, it's us, right? They're selling us to the sponsor.
Yeah.
And so if something wasn't getting huge numbers, it would just get canceled relatively quickly. And you know, somebody mentioned that about, like, you know, the ratings that Ellen got on ABC, or that My So-Called Life got. Those ratings, if a Fox show had gotten those ratings at that time, it would have been considered a hit. But for ABC, 8 million viewers was small potatoes at the time, right? So, but now you don't need that, right? You can have a show like, you know, NBC aired 4 episodes of Connecting and then canceled it, and the other 4 episodes all went up onto streaming platforms. I watched it last night, you know, months later. You can do that now, right? And you can
Who is in that? I don't even know that show.
So it's a brilliant idea. It's a show about, it's a sitcom about a group of friends during the COVID lockdown. And so it's all sort of through Zoom. And it's a very cool, it's got a trans central character. It's got, I mean, it's an ensemble show, but it's this small group of friends. One of them's a trans woman. One is a gay man, and he and his husband have 2 kids. You never see the husband or the kids because it's just the friends on the video link. But it gets into things like it takes place over time. I think it premiered in the fall, but every episode says this episode takes place on such and such date. So the first episode is at the beginning of the lockdown. And I think episode 3 maybe ends with somebody is looking at their phone and says, you guys have to see this. And you see them all reacting to what they're seeing, and you piece together that it's the George Floyd killing. And then the next episode is the Black Lives Matters protest. And a lot of the characters are Black. So, you know, how that impacts them as Black people in America. And it's a really...
And this is a series that was on ABC for a couple episodes? NBC.
NBC commissioned 8 episodes. After 4 episodes, they canceled it from their, you know, broadcast feed. But it went up onto Peacock. It went up onto Hulu. So last night I binged it on Hulu. And it was... There were 2 episodes I didn't like, but 6 episodes that I thought were really good. Yeah.
Oh, I'm going to take a look. That's interesting.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. And you were involved as a consultant on the Apple TV documentary, Out, The Visibility.
Yeah, I was the lead historical consultant. The producers got in touch with me about 2 years before it came out and said, you literally wrote the book on this. Would you like to be part of this? And I said, why, yes. And so...
It's a great docu-series. I loved it.
I love what they did with, I mean, I just gave them information on what had aired and helped them track down a lot of the clips. But then what they did with it was kind of magical. I find that whole process of, you know, creating narratives that are coherent, you know, again, why I'm a translator rather than an author mostly. That's the part I find hard. And they did such a great job with it. And so, yeah, and then they sent me the script for every episode and the rough cuts, and I would go through and say, well, you know, that's not quite accurate, or, you know, you're talking about 1972, but then you have this clip from it that's clearly from 89. So just like little minor tweaks, but the rough cut they sent me was already so good. And if you haven't seen Visible out on television, and the other one that's very much worth seeing that I wasn't involved with was Disclosure on Netflix.
Loved that. The Laverne Cox. Yeah.
Yeah. The history of trans images in the American entertainment media. And it's also just brilliantly done. She
produced an amazing doc. Yeah, I thought so too. So what do you translate? Or what language are you translating?
I work from a bunch of Romance languages into English. And it's a weird mix of stuff I do. So right now I've been commissioned to translate 2 stage plays into English, one from Catalan, one from Spanish, some 16th century Sephardic Jewish documents translated from Ladino to English, and then I've got medical charts coming in next week. So it's just a weird.
Do you need to speak those languages to do that, or?
You need to read them fluently, yeah. And you need to have a good wall of dictionaries to pull it off. So.
Well, that's great, Steven. This has been so great. I could talk. I mean, I'm a television nerd, so I love television, and I could talk about it for hours. I so appreciate you spending the time with me. Steven's book, the 20th anniversary edition, is available on Amazon. Correct?
It is available pretty much everywhere. Yeah. It's out as an ebook. It's out as a paperback. If you're on Twitter, you can follow me at Steven Capsuto, StevenCapsuto. Usually, most days, if I have time, I post video clips under the heading "Today in Queer TV History."
And you do that on this as well, on your Facebook alternate channels.
I do on the Facebook page also, but with Facebook, when you subscribe to a page, you don't see all the posts, whereas with Twitter, you're more likely to see all the posts. And I've got some clips coming up from As the World Turns and Guiding Light.
Oh, you do? When? When are they going to be
I
up?
don't know. I have to. I am slowly. So the way I do this is I have my research database, which was mostly 20th century, and I'm slowly adding the 21st century stuff in.
Oh,
So
great.
so I'm pretty sure there's some Luke and Noah stuff coming up, and maybe some Hank
If you
stuff.
remember, tag the Locker Room on Facebook. I'll share it so people can see it as well.
Very good. Very good.
Have a great New Year, Stephen. Thank you so much
You
for
too.
spending the time.
Take care, Alan.
Bye-bye. Don't forget, everybody, you can pick up Stephen's book. It has a wealth of information. And if you haven't yet subscribed to the Locker Room, you can do so right here, right below. And don't forget to turn on the notifications so you get reminders of upcoming shows. Have a great New Year, everybody. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in 2021.